So today we're going to take a look at this little amplifier that promises to output up to 300 watts per channel for just 500 bucks. Is it any good? Well, let's talk about that.
Say you don't wanna be with me, but you miss me as soon as it's over. Your name lighting up the screen, but you never call when you're sober. You say you don't like the games, but you play me like there's no tomorrow. You should know that I'm fed up with your lies, so don't come closer.
Alright, so here it is, the XTZ Edge amplifier. Now in case you're not familiar with who XTZ is, they're a Swedish manufacturer that's most famous for their loudspeakers, but it looks like they're also beginning to enter the electronics market, and what you're looking at is one of their first forays into that space. And that leads me to the Edge and what you get with it. So the Edge is a compact Class D amplifier that outputs 150 watts into 8 ohms and 300 watts into 4 ohms with 113 dB worth of dynamic range. Now the amplifier may be small, but it's very solid. The chassis is made out of aluminum, and I think it looks very clean. In fact, we have the subtle logo etched into the front plate. We have the model number text silk screen onto the top plate right here, and I also love how there's healthy ventilation on the side. Even though Class D is very efficient and tends to run cool, it still generates heat, and as some of you know, heat kills electronics. So this amplifier should last for a very long time. Let's take a quick look at the back. I love these copper binding posts. Really, really beautiful. We have an analog input, we have our power switch, place for the power cord, and we have a gain potentiometer. So this is what's going to help give this amp such flexibility, because this will allow you to adjust the gain of the amplifier, which means you can pair up just about any preamp to it. In fact, you can even connect your phone to this amplifier and control the volume via mixing the output of the phone with the output of the amplifier. So it means it should work for most people just fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look on the inside, and then I'm going to talk about how it performs. All right, so here it is, and I can already hear some people complaining about the lack of huge transformers and heat sinks. So if that's you, here's what's going on. One of the benefits behind Class D amplifiers is that they are incredibly power efficient. In the case of the XTZ, it's 90% efficient, which means 90% of the power that it draws from the wall is successfully converted into output power that goes to your speakers, which is incredible. That is way better than any traditional Class AB amplifier. And what that also means is that the manufacturer doesn't need to invest in huge transformers and heat sinks to deal with waste, which translates into heat. Another benefit is going to be low noise. And of course, this enables manufacturers to get a lot of power out of a relatively small device at an affordable price. Now, taking a closer look, you're going to notice that this amplifier will use the Bang & Olufsen Ice Power 300 ASC module, a very good module, and overall it has a very clean internal design. So now it's time to talk about how it performs. Okay, so when it comes to raw performance, I'm going to lay it down for you guys like this. If you're in the market for a warm and lush sounding amplifier, then the XTZ is not for you. If you're in the market for something that has an aggressive top end, then again, this amplifier is not going to be for you. Instead, it's going to be for somebody who wants something small that has good power, good dynamic range, something that has good clarity, as well as a fairly balanced frequency response. If that's what you're looking for and this is within your budget, then you know what? It may be worth checking out this amplifier. And that leads me to its overall performance envelope, starting with the character. So every amplifier has a sound, right? I know some of you may disagree with that, but that has been my experience. And when it comes to the XTZ, what you're going to find is a presentation that's balanced, but it does err towards the cool side of neutral. And you're going to notice this most within the upper mid-range. Now, you're also going to notice that it does have a slightly dry sound compared to your typical Class AB amplifier in this range. And now let's focus on the different elements of the presentation, starting with the treble. So I think the treble may be the star of the show here. Even though Class D is known for bass, this is where I think the amplifier shines the most and truly digs into high-end territory, because the treble is fairly neutral, meaning that what you experience is going to be a direct reflection of the components and the recordings that you're listening to. So if you have bright sounding recordings and bright sounding speakers, that's what you're going to get. If you have smooth sounding speakers and you listen to fairly decent recordings, well, that's what you're going to get. But overall, what I like so much about it is not only does it have really good detail, but it doesn't artificially bump up the top end to give you this artificial sense of detail. It's very natural sounding, but here's the big thing. This amplifier does a great job with what I call spatial separation, which is when all those little details seem to be given their own sense of space instead of sounding like they're all just kind of jumbled up together and mixed, which is what you're going to normally find with amplifiers in this class. And that's what makes the XTZ so unusual, is that it dips into high-end territory by giving you that great spatial separation, particularly within the top end. All those little details, super easy to hear, even on average loudspeakers. So now let's talk about the mid-range. So the mid-range is going to have a very open and clear sound. Again, it's not going to have this artificial sense of warmth to it. Instead, it's going to be more of a matter-of-fact presentation. Now, the upper mid-range does see a little bit of a dip, and this can give, let's say, female vocalists a little bit more of a nasally quality. Definitely not going to be for everybody, but I think most people, or at least a lot of people, are still going to appreciate that open, kind of clear sound that this amp has within the mid-range. Now let's talk about the bass. Look, like all Class D amplifiers, the bass of this amp is really good. Its damping factor is over 1500, which means if you have speakers that use very thick woofers and they're just difficult to drive, you know they need a muscular amp, this is going to be a great natural match for those speakers. And plus, if you just like deep, strong, controlled bass, this amp has it, that's for sure. Now let's talk about dynamics. Dynamics overall is going to be good, especially for something at this price point. You can listen at fairly loud volumes and get very clean output out of it. And again, if you listen to full-scale orchestral pieces, which are known for having these big dynamic shifts, this little amplifier does a very admirable job of handling those peaks. Next, let's talk about imaging. So when it comes to the ability to lay down a soundstage, usually that's more in the speaker domain. So with this amplifier, I would say it's fairly neutral in that regard. Whatever your speakers are capable of doing, it's not going to get in the way of that. Speaking of speakers, let's talk about equipment matching and what this amp tends to work well with. Alright, so first let's talk about how this amplifier pairs up to a wide variety of speakers, because historically speaking, one of the biggest issues that pulse width modulation amplifiers have is pairing up to a wide variety of products. And that's because the impedance characteristics of a loudspeaker will have a direct impact over how a Class D amp behaves, with some loudspeakers causing the amp to have a lot of distortion and to change its overall frequency response with tilted up treble and so on and so forth. So I'm pleased to announce that it seems like this Bang & Olufsen module does a great job of leveraging itself across a wide variety of speakers, because as I tested this amplifier across Klipsch, Tekton, Buchardt, Harbeth, PMC, and many other different speakers, I noticed that the sound remained steadfast. The characteristics I reported earlier transferred over into every single listening experience that I had with the speakers, making it a pretty easy recommendation. And now let's talk about how it pairs up to preamplifiers. Now, I only have a couple of preamplifiers on hand, but the good news is this: it has a little gain switch on the back, and this is very important because different preamplifiers have different output voltages, which can sometimes make it tricky to pair them up with the right amplifier. But when you have something like this with the gain control, you can actually match it to the preamplifier, and then you're off to the races. So you should be good with just about any preamplifier on the market, making this a very flexible little amplifier. In fact, flexibility seems to be what it's all about. But still, it's not perfect, so let's talk about some of those imperfections now. So for $500, there's not a whole lot to complain about, because what you're getting for your money is a compact, very well made amplifier that's flexible, capable of powering most loudspeakers fairly well, and on top of that, you're also getting really good overall performance. But still, nothing's for everybody, and in the case of the XTZ, it still has that typical Class D sound, meaning that it's still going to be on the cool side of neutral, it's going to have a slightly dry character to it, and then there's going to be that little dip in the upper mid-range, and that's not going to be to everybody's taste. Otherwise though, it seems like an easy recommendation for somebody who's looking for a good amount of power from something that's small and relatively affordable. And that leads me to my final thoughts. Alright guys, so this is going to be my take on the XTZ Edge amplifier. As I said before, this is a very straightforward piece. If you have a budget of around $500, you know you want good power, you want a clear, balanced sound, then this is something worth checking out. If you want something that has more of a warmer presentation, then there may be products that will make you just a little bit happier. In fact, at the end of this video, I'm going to have some comparisons between how I feel this amp competes against some other amplifiers, sort of kind of within the same price range. So if you're interested in that, feel free to stick around. Otherwise, if you've reached the finish line, then as always, I appreciate you checking out my videos. And until next time, peace. Okay, so real talk. I don't have any other $500 amplifiers on hand right now, but because you guys love comparisons so much, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you all about how the XTZ competes against two traditional Class AB amplifiers at different price points, one of which is going to be slightly less expensive, and then the other is going to be literally over double the cost. So let's dive straight on in and talk about how the XTZ competes against the IOTA VX PA3 amplifier. Now the IOTA VX retails for $300, and it's more like your typical Class AB amp. Now when it comes to the comparison, I'll say this. The IOTA VX definitely has some draw to it in the sense that it's pretty balanced for what it is, and then it has this warmth within the mid-range and this overall muscular presentation. But when you compare it directly to the XTZ, you're going to notice that, objectively speaking, the XTZ is better. It's cleaner, it's clear, it's even more balanced, and when you first listen to the treble, you're going to notice that the treble's more refined, it's more detailed, and it has spatial separation that the IOTA VX just does not have. And plus, it's going to be even smoother despite all of that. Now, as we move on to the mid-range, they're going to be very different from one another. The XTZ has this cleaner, clear, more open sound, whereas the IOTA VX has a warmer, denser, and fuller presentation. Then as we move on to the bass on the XTZ is going to be notably cleaner, and because it's capable of controlling very difficult to drive speakers, it's going to be a little bit more versatile in this regard, whereas the IOTA VX has that more muscular presentation, but it's not going to be as quick and agile in direct comparison. Of course, the XTZ is going to have a lower noise floor, and overall it's going to be the more versatile amplifier. So now let's move on to talking about how it compares to something that's more than double the cost, and that's going to be the Dina-Frips Hyperion amplifier, which I believe retails for around $1,200 to $1,300. So this is how they compare it. The XTZ is going to have overall a cooler presentation, whereas the Dina-Frips is going to have that slightly warmer sound. Otherwise, though, it's a very interesting comparison because some of the advantages that the XTZ has over the more affordable IOTA VX doesn't completely translate to this comparison, because the more than double the price Hyperion has really good performance for the money. So let's start off with the treble. So the Hyperion has more of a matter-of-fact top end. Now this is where the XTZ is going to have an advantage. The top end is still going to be smoother than the Dina-Frips Hyperion. However, overall detail is going to be about the same. Spatial separation is going to be about the same. So now let's move on to the mid-range. So the mid-range on the Dina-Frips, like the IOTA VX, is going to be warmer, fuller sounding, only it's still going to have really, really good clarity. So in terms of overall advantages with clarity, they're actually very similar. They just have a very different sound, with the XTZ being more on the cooler side of neutral. And then when we talk about bass, it works out to be the same as it is with the IOTA VX. The XTZ is going to have a better damping factor. It's just going to be able to control difficult speakers a little bit better than the Hyperion. But when it comes to overall presence, right, just that sensation of power, the Hyperion is still going to have that more muscular presentation, whereas the XTZ is going to be a little bit more about refinement and clarity. So overall, that's how they stack up. So the XTZ, I would say, is a pretty good amplifier for the money, and in some ways can even hang with a traditional Class AB amplifier that costs a lot more money. Of course, it depends on your taste in terms of what you're going to prefer. So anyways, guys, that's my take on all of it and my final take on this amplifier. Thanks for watching, and until next time. Peace.